Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It is July 26, 2021, and today we bring you another seminar from the Myanmar Update Conference held earlier this month. This episode features Nicola Williams, PhD candidate at the Australian National University, with her talk, The Contested State of Burma, Conflict, Coups, and the Federalism Puzzle or Promise. Nicola is introduced by Dr. Nick Cheeseman, Director of the Myanmar Research Centre, and she answers one question after her talk. Enjoy.
Our next speaker is Nicola Williams, who for over 12 years is working in international development and affairs in a variety of countries, including for 4.5 years in Myanmar with the Asia Foundation before coming to commence a PhD at the Crawford School at the Australian National University. And I'm going to take this moment, if you allow me to, the audience and Nicola, to just advertise the fact that thanks to Nicola's involvement in the Myanmar Research Centre, we now have active a policy dialogue program, which in response to the critical situation in Myanmar is designed to really deliver to people in government, international organizations, and local NGOs informed, concise, and timely information and recommendations about what's going on there. And I really I'm very impressed by the work that Nicola's already been doing on that program, and in due course we'll be publicizing more about it. I think that's maybe just sort of a teaser for what's to come. And what's to come right now is the presentation on the topic of the contested state of Myanmar conflict, coups, and the federalism puzzle. Thanks, Nicola.
Thank you for the introduction. To be covered in this presentation, my paper goes backwards before it goes forwards. And I'll sort of traverse the past and the present as I go through these different areas of characterizing the contested state, protracted cycles of conflict and coup making, the state building and nation building, institutionalization of ethnicity, alternative state building and nation building by armed groups and movements and multiple ethno-nationalisms, and the federalism puzzle and a complex ethnic jigsaw. Firstly, characterizing the contested state. While a little bit of this is cut off above you here, I've got sort of a framework here about what drives protracted conflict and dimensions of contest. There are many realms of contest over the Myanmar state: the structure of the state, who governs it, and the nature of the state at the national level. Divisions of power between the Burman-dominated centre and ethnic minority groups goes to the heart of the contested state and decades of struggle. In light of the 2021 coup, who controls the state, civil and military, has returned as the central battleground. Protracted conflict prior to the coup, Myanmar subnational conflicts have affected more than 1/3 of the country before the events of February. With the rising urban violence and guerrilla warfare by People's Defence Forces, the conflict now covers the centre of the country too, and the coverage is much broader. Local conflict in the past has been generated by competing local demands for control of territory, authority over populations, and access to resources. In the wake of the coup, the battleground for who controls the state cuts across both that national and subnational levels. You'll see the arrows here pointing downwards from the national level and upwards in terms of state building and nation building, and alternative state building and nation building. War-making, state building and nation building by the Tatmadaw has fueled multiple and competing ethno-nationalisms while driving alternative state-making processes and nation-building agendas. Contest around the structure of the state has also driven contest over who governs it. With the backdrop of ethnic and other insurgencies of the 1950s, ethnic conflicts and other insurgencies in the 1950s and early 1960s, Prime Minister U Nu's 1962 plans to grant more statehood claims and consider Shan's succession rights from the Penglong Agreement were seen as a threat to national unity and served partly to justify Ne Win's takeover in 1962. While the 2021 coup has been characterised as not being ideologically driven, in some respects it resonates with the Tatmadaw's SLORC SPDC positioning post-1988 as positioning of the Tatmadaw as the ideology. In the aftermath of the 2021 coup, public policy discourses have touched on state failure and state collapse scenarios. In such a diagnosis, there are conceptual distinctions that importantly need to be made between functional failure and institutional collapse, and remembering that state collapse is a very rare event. By Weberian standards, the Myanmar state has consistently functionally failed. For instance, to maintain a monopoly on the use of force, exercise control over sovereign territory, secure a functioning market, or provide social welfare. Myanmar could be characterised as having state functional failure while evading state collapse on different occasions. Some of its institutions have collapsed on occasions, but not the state entirely. Fragility conformance states from extremes of incapacity or illegitimacy. Extreme illegitimacy is also known to contribute significantly to instability. The legitimacy deficit in the wake of the coup is exacerbating functional state failure. Distinct from previous coups and changes in government, this time the generals are rolling back nascent decentralisation efforts. With state legislatures suspended and the General Administrative Department back under military control, the rapid re-centralisation and militarisation is marked by contest at local to national levels. Ward administrators to township officials are now becoming targets for armed violence. Both the regime and the state it seeks to control is under attack. These two maps here present just a scrape of the complexity of the security sector landscape. And this is a map from another report which I co-authored in 2017 of the ethnic armed groups connected to townships where they have a presence. And then we have this diagram here. This is from the Reuters Insights team. And this is a township map similar to this one, characterising where local governments have been formed in underneath the CPRH at the time, as it were. So this sort of shows that local level variation and contest that's taking place around who controls the state at subnational levels. State building and nation building. There's obviously many conceptualizations of state building across literatures and generations of scholarship. State building for war from Tilley, state building for peace after the Cold War. Scholars have often cited the need for nation building to avoid ethnic conflicts or otherwise. And while nation building is often positioned as the benign but necessary relative of state building, it can have perverse effects, driving cleavages and conflict rather than building unity. Now, all of us in this room, I'm sure we know the story of the Tatmadaw as the state builder, creating roads, infrastructure projects, and expanding the centre to the periphery as part of its insurgency tactics. And this feeds into conflict cycles. We know the use of development for pacification efforts and narratives in response on development and ethnic states include no development without peace, speaking to these old tactics. Nation building efforts are well known too, and I use some of what exists in the literature and then zone in on some specific features of nation building in my paper. Nation building can include citizenship legislation, use of ethnic categories, the SLOG SPDC rewriting of Myanmar's history and the troubled democracy period, museums telling the story of the military saviours of a nation. In the NLD military hybrid period, we also witnessed contested state building and nation building practices. This picture of Aung San is from KR. So the building of statues, the renaming of roads and bridges in ethnic areas. My study focuses on some of the practices of nation building and state building using theory on ethnic civil conflict and the role of ethnic institutionalization. Sometimes, but not always, ethnic cleavages lead to ethnic violence. It is known that patterns of social identification shape conflict risks, and conflict in turn also shapes patterns of social identification. Here I just highlight some of the ethnic institutionalization processes that have taken place during state formation processes in Burma from 47 onwards. Firstly, just a quote from a paper on the institutional origins of ethnic violence. And I want you to think to yourself if this sounds familiar. And this is sort of a bit of theory around strong internal ethnic institutionalization. The state deliberately and consistently identifies ethnic categories, One can observe graduations of institutionalization in terms of the number and consistency of the use of the same ethnic categories. Citizens will routinely be forced to choose from the categories presented by the state. They become less likely to use hybrids or other categories, and more likely to use state labels to identify themselves to recognize co-ethnics. Such choices have enduring consequences for the salience of social identities and intergroup relations. State institutions strongly influence the origins of ethnic differences, especially under colonial rule. So looking at the practices here, then relating that back to Myanmar, we have categorization and enumeration. And obviously the census process received a lot of attention in policy and academic literature, but there's also the GAD household process that's been going on annually for decades in terms of how ethnicity is defined, how your household is listed, generated. I just sort of highlight this, having translated and used some of the GAD data to look into that mindset. So this is some of the categorizations: national citizens, and then the foreigners, the Bangladesh, the Indian, the Chinese, Pakistan. Citizenship ID cards, policies, bureaucratic discrimination, ethnic territorial demarcation, mobilization of nationalist and religious groups. That are some of the examples that I draw on in the paper. To highlight this role of ethnic institutionalization, increasing ethnic differentiation, and that contributing to how social identification practices take place, ethnic relations, tensions, and indeed armed conflict at the end of the spectrum. Zoning in on one of those practices that I've just highlighted, the carving out of ethnic zones in the contested state of Shan. And I focus on Shan in part of the paper because it's a very important piece of the federalism puzzle and the ethnic jigsaw. And this transition that we've had, really only a short period of time, from principalities to armed group, and the role of conflict in that process. So 1989 round of ceasefires and arrangements led to some armed groups gaining more special zones, providing for some political autonomy, business concessions, and the ability for groups to maintain their weapons. During the military's national convention to draft the 2008 constitution, the process of determining which ethnic groups received self-administrative status was largely numerical, drawing on unreliable population data around having a majority in 2 townships which are side by side. 15 groups sought self-administrative status in the 1994 session of the National Convention, and most applications failed. Several groups with armies and ceasefires in Shan were successful. And there are also other details and parameters around the application process. Shan State also demonstrates in this process attempts by the military to manage ethnic conflict as opposed to resolve it through demarcation of ethnic territory, pacifying some groups and weakening others. And this, my paper argues, these processes of state building and nation building by the military, by the hybrid, contribute to the alternative state building and nation building processes. And they've come from different realms at different parts of Myanmar's state formation history. So part of the alternative process is, unfortunately, this continued adoption of the same categories and using them again in local politics and in conflict narratives, fueling multiple ethno-nationalisms. We have examples, some of them actually very positive in terms of what other service provision is done in contested areas of Myanmar. And the country has multiple sovereignties of political authority across Myanmar's contested areas, given the service provision by armed groups and ethnic service providers. There's also alternative process of proposing how to restructure the state by ethnic leaders, such as designing state constitutions in exile for a new federal system. We've got Burma-dominated democracy movements and alternative governments' efforts to gain recognition abroad, from UNU to the 1990s NLD-backed national coalition government of the Union of Burma. Alternative nation building by ethnic armed groups and political actors, obviously ethnic histories, culture, language, and narratives on past kingdoms. And I have the picture here of the leader of the Arakan army, who was speaking on this occasion about the way of Rakita. And to quote from his statement on April 11th, he talked about, we will help people for their desired political demands, but we don't need the CDM or street protests in Rakhine. We have a way of Rakita. We have have clear political objectives, and spoke of it. In the early period of the revolution, we worked mostly on mobilising and war affairs for our political objectives, but now we're implementing a governance mechanism with strong institutions for public administration affairs, including administration, judiciary, and public security. A very well-known and obviously new form of alternative state building and nation building is obviously the NUG process happening right now. And I've just highlighted sort of different steps that the NUG have taken in this effort to secure support and legitimacy for their agenda. I'll end on this area of the federalism puzzle. So what do we know from comparative federalism literature and empirical studies? Evidence shows that ethnic-based federal systems in conflict-affected contexts are problematic for peace-building goals, fueling conflict by institutionalising ethno-nationalist political dynamics and identity politics. Federalism has reached a mythical status in Myanmar as a guarantee for peace, and alternative state making is hinged on this ability. Proposals since 1947 in Myanmar have mainly been ethnic-based systems around a federal system, which institutionalise majority-minority relations, singular ethnic identities, and without addressing minority and sub-minority relations. Regional-based federalism has been perceived as a threat to minorities with the potential to enable Burmanisation. Since early federalism debates, the landscape has become obviously more complex. More armed groups and additional statehood claims have been made. For instance, in the peace process, the Wa, Ta'ang, Pa'o all made statehood claims to upgrade from their zone status, and the Shawnee as well in Kachin State and Sagaing region. This has been rebuffed by the KO in the case of Kachin. There's also then the sub-national layers of conflict that are at play between and along clan lines. In Rakhine, as the Arakan army continues to advance as a local provider of governance and its nation-building agenda, this is probably of Rohingya returns. The peace process was a state-building agenda focused on federalism. And there were some debilitating similarities to the National Convention in design, with the majority acting as the power centre, taking submissions from the minority of the autonomy which they seek. I won't go through all the points there, but I do sort of go back and forward in terms of how this contest around federalism always provokes a strong response from the military, and some of the changes that have happened around who governs and the contest around the structure of the state. Cognizant that the key battleground right now is who controls the state and how to help people, of course, suffering from COVID, the implications here really speak to the ongoing debate around the structure of the state, which will, of course, continue in alternative state-making, nation-building processes. So debates around federalism, obviously need to be handled very carefully. They can fuel ethno-nationalisms, exacerbate majority-minority contest, bring up new and old claims of territory, and inter- and interfactional dynamics. My paper sort of in nodding towards the present and where we're going also considers this worthy of consideration, how to break from military and colonial legacies of ethnic institutionalisation and asymmetric dynamics in alternative state making and nation building around a future system of governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That was fantastic. So we have 2-3 questions. All right, we'll bundle them. Okay, thank you. So first, before we do that, we have a question from Abanya Hongsa asking, I think in a way it sort of goes back to our keynote address by Professor Lee previously, asking about whether or not China and Russia are a threat to the democratic transition, and what then we may think about the relations for UK and the West. Broadly speaking, to Myanmar, do the presenters believe that the trading ban, I think referring to weapons, is the answer to the problem? And what likelihood for some type of dialogue between the NUG and SAC in the near future? Nicola, I've nominated you to take that one for us, please. Thank you.
Thank you for the long question. I'll just break off a few parts of it rather than answer all of it for the benefit of time. Speaking to the arms trade issue and connecting that back up with the implication of Russia and China's support, they're more than 60% of the weapons that are going to Myanmar being sold to Myanmar, and it's unlikely to change in that regard. So in terms of different sanctions and different punitive measures, I wouldn't say that the arms focus and arms embargoes are the key lever in terms of punitive measures, and probably won't have significant impact given that China-Russia-Myanmar relations won't be changing under the junta. Speaking to the other part of your question, the NUG and the SAC and the likelihood of dialogue in the next 100 days or at the end of 2021, I would say at this point in time that is unlikely. Both groups have called the other a terrorist organisation, and ASEAN's sort of failing efforts to deal with this crisis is indeed due to not being able to get those parties to meet. ASEAN doesn't have many tools in its toolbox and is not equipped to deal with unconstitutional behaviour and coups. So I doubt that we will see any more effective role of ASEAN, and the possibility of mediation right now is unlikely.
Nicola, tremendous. Thank you very much.